I won't lie. When Mind Clash sent me this, I was both intrigued, impressed, and also quite trepidatious. What I'm holding in front of me right now is a trilogy of rule books, folks. That's the first thing. I have a glossary, I have a rule book, and I have a compendium. Now, that may sound not impressive, but let me be very clear, first and foremost. This game actually will be very nicely adapting to your type of play. And what I mean by that is we have solo, we have cooperative, and we have competitive. The first biggest thing that I will say about this game, the thing that always has irked me when I have played other games solo versus two-handed versus multiplayer, and this is going to sound trivial when we start talking about the depth of play and the other aspects of this game, but the main design aspect that I am most impressed by, as weird as this sounds, is the fact that the solo game, the competitive game, and the cooperative game are essentially the same game with some minor tweaks. Too often, I see solo games with whatever they may be. Okay, you need to do this, this, and this. Now, whenever I see competitive, cooperative, solo, typically it is competitive, cooperative. You have this set of rules displayed in front of you. Then, solo version, you're going to have to dramatically alter one of the core or several minor core elements of how the game actually flows, the mechanistic approach or the dynamics that are offered in the first place. And this game really doesn't fluctuate away, no matter what the mode, that core drive in what it brings to the table. You have your 3 phases, you play your cards during those phases, you get anywhere between the mid-teens to the mid-20s number of turns and actions, and that is essentially what you're doing. It never gets far enough away from that to make you feel like if you change modes, if you have a preferred mode, but then are adapting it to playing solo to learn or to teach or to enjoy and then playing it with a group, that you are having a dynamically different game experience than other people. And that's really impressive, actually. We don't see games designed like that typically. The second big point here is that the actual turns themselves are straightforward in terms of what you're doing, right? There's nothing more frustrating than not knowing what you're actually trying to do on your turn. All you're doing in this case is you're taking one of these cards that are in front of me, my 9 starting cards, potentially looped out or looped in, if I have a focus card of the faction or the house that I'm having to sub in or sub out, and you just take potentially 2 of these 3, or potentially all 3 of them, actions on a turn-by-turn basis. And even some of the actions themselves, in this case, can be split up into 2 parts, either or both. And all of these are dynamically different, as you can see here. Reinforcement, prosperity, production, innovation, politics, progress, temptation, conquest, and development. And so the wide variety of what these are all bringing to the table, even before you start to get into the other depth of dynamics that they offer, is nice because you're only going to get to choose several of these a turn. And that's the blessing curse which makes this game so thinky in the first place. Now, having 9 of these cards, having 2 to 3 of them available to you per turn, per choosing, per round, again, it's going to sound a little overwhelming, but you're going to start to strategize and stratify what you're wanting to do because you're going to have some of this actual resource management here. And again, this is a very clever resource management. You have the production and you have your storage. Production is non-linear, meaning the higher the production, you don't get 1-to-1. The other great dynamic difference in this game is that all of the houses offer you an asymmetric experience within the scenario that you may have set up on the board in the first place. Because all of them come with 2 technologies that are going to be available in a market combined from all of the houses being used in a game. And they are going to be obtainable, but they're also going to offer you asymmetry in the form of whichever one you choose at the beginning of the game, you have the ability to get an advanced option of it that no one else can do as well. And again, having about 14 different houses in the game in the first place means that even if I set this scenario up in front of you that I have right now, if I change which house I am, it's going to drastically, and I don't say that minor, drastically give you the ability to change how the dynamics are playing on a turn-by-turn basis. That being said, though, there is also a very deterministic approach that is going to be very widely appealing to Euro lovers in general. And that is the often malaligned combat phase of this game, the third phase that you are going through and going to attack you on a turn-by-turn basis. And that's going to happen at the ends of rounds 2 and 3. The great thing, and why I say that that's going to be more appealing to a lot of people, is because the actual way in which it's incorporated at the ends of round 2 and 3, as the Void are going to be going towards your colonies, your ships, your home, essentially, that you've made your home even, they are going to be known quantities. There is no measuring, guessing, dice rolling, assuming, anything along those lines. And that's true when you go out and you attack somebody else. There is a design system of this is the first round of combat, this is the second round of combat, you take damage, you absorb damage, you take damage, you absorb damage, you go back and forth until somebody is gone, period. It is deterministic. It eliminates the possibility of situations where you are questioning whether or not you will win. You will either win or you will lose. And you can figure that out very quickly, back and forth, without too much dynamic trouble, because of what you know your ships, their ships, enemy ships, whoever it may be, are going to bring in terms of defense, offense, absorption, shields, technology, everything along those lines. And that's, honestly, in the world of dice chucking that I live often, it's both a pet peeve, but it's also relieving in a way too, that you just know you're going in and winning. Or if you're not, well, you shouldn't go in the first place. And bringing back to asymmetry here for a second, we also have agendas. Agenda cards that are going to be available to you as additional ways of scoring that are not only going to give you immediate benefit, but are also going to be scored at the end of the rounds in one of 4 various types that are going to give you different ways in prioritizing your asymmetry of your faction as opposed to your opponents, depending on the board state as well as depending on what availability is present in the first place. These cards are acquired and then actually slotted, so the top part actually goes under your individual player board and the bottom tells you exactly what you're getting if you can achieve those requirements each round, which are not insignificant. The player board itself here, as you can see, lines up your 3 tracks that you're going to be utilizing in order to get further unlocks, as well as gather your energy or your power for putting out your spaceships in the first place. If it's not here, you can't put it on the board. You have a certain number of slots for technology at the top, and again, a certain number of slots for those agenda cards at the bottom that you slowly unlock. The tech tree and resource management system works. It is clever. It is fully fleshed out. And again, from an optimization layering of decision making, just like with your focus cards on a hand turn-by-turn basis, it offers both risk and reward of your limited supply of choices and actions that you have to put these out here. Your guilds, for example, as you're laying them down and building up the areas that you may need in order to gather more resources, are very limited. How you control space in more of a 4X manner matters. Because in order to gather resources, you need to control. The Voidborn will be controlling. You will have to be the aggressor. This game does not reward turtling, although it can be beneficial. Now let me spend a few minutes talking about a few points to help you figure out, okay, Chris, those are all excellent things. You've sold me on the mechanics, the Euro-glyphic style of this 4X faring game. What are the things that if I'm looking at could be make-its or break-its for me at this point? First and foremost, this is a big game. I don't say that as box-wise. I have boxes that are bigger than this. I say this as a table space situation. This is incredibly laborious in terms of the amount of space. I don't even have enough to set it up all in front of you on this 3 foot by 3 foot, just over, table in front of me at this point. So you need dedicated large table space, which most of you are going to go isn't a big deal. As you have heard elsewhere, right? And it bears repeating that this is a labor of love in terms of this side of things, but also just an actual setting this up. Just setting this game up for demo purposes in this video, it probably took me almost half an hour. So think about that for a minute, just for these purposes, not even having all of the elements on there. And that's not insignificant for a lot of people. You have to weigh whether or not that is going to be more of a burden or whether that is a cross you can bear given the dynamic, excellent gameplay as a whole. Because let's be also very frank about this. This is bringing and providing an excellent experience from this style of Euro game. I wouldn't go as far as the crowdfunding campaign did as saying this is Spirit Island in space. It's not. It's completely a different animal. The other aspect that I have to mention is, although the main mechanism is playing these focus cards, right? There are so many elements being managed by these focus cards, the irony of that name there, right? Focus cards, and having such a lack of focus in terms of what you can do, often is going to be a conundrum for players. There is just a wide path that you can choose to navigate in this Euro optimization puzzle that may leave you just not choosing correctly. It becomes, again, sort of like the combat, a little bit more deterministic in terms of you can start to see the wheels turning, the gears churning, and if I don't start to have this by a certain point in this very limited, again, 3-round game, you're going to not be where you want to be. And going back to the beginning, folks, going back to the very beginning, I mentioned this. These are excellently, technically written books. The compendium, the rule book, the glossary, they are the most informative rule books, detailed in a way more of a technical writer than I've ever seen probably in a board game in a nutshell. Though, as I saw online, I'm going to steal this term, Euro-glyphics is highly present. We have here a 5 pages just of iconography that you're going to be having to internalize. Now, they say once you internalize it, it's really easy. And some of this stuff is straightforward, but some of this stuff is not as intuitive as you may like. And so having this much is also, again, a little bit trepidatious. Maybe not for yourself necessarily, but teaching to other people, how much of a big deal is that going to be when you throw this their way? Are you going to get your money's worth even with this galactic box? Absolutely. If this is your ilk, let me be very clear. It offers more of a wild comparison here in terms of value, like one of my other games from earlier in the year, Race to the Raft. Because this compendium, let me illustrate to you what this compendium has going on. Once you get past the setup, you start seeing scenarios here that, again, are all optimized for whatever you want to do. Single player, competitive, cooperative, dynamically different, starting all over the place for the Voidborn, different safe havens, different factions that can be used every time, all different difficulties, game lengths, and this is just incredibly detailed for everything that you would ever want here, as well as going into the technology sections of things as well. And so the amount of effort and technical approach that's gone into this from a whole is really overwhelmingly impressive. But that being said, this also is going to have to be, I hate to say it, and to use this term being thrown around not lightly, a lifestyle game from a Euro side of things. This is not going to be a game a la the Hansa Teutonikas, where yes, the core mechanism of what you're doing is straightforward, but as I mentioned, the internalization, the Euro-glyphics, and the overall burden that this brings from a both physical and mental presence is going to require repeated plays in order to get anywhere near the level of investment that you would potentially want out of something half its size, weight, shape, or cost. And that's the up and down that you're going to have to weigh. Again, to be very clear here, I am skipping over a lot of rules. I am skipping over a lot of mechanisms. You can go watch, gaming rules for that. I watched that thing like 3 times in order to learn how to play this. And even then, you're still going to struggle. I'm going to argue that if you can get past that struggle, though, it's going to give you an experience that is probably not like any other out there in the board gaming scene. Period. But now when we're talking about the saturation of games, and we're talking about bloat, not necessarily even just production bloat on crowdfunding, but we're also talking about mechanistic bloat, I also wonder that this design is, as someone else put very succinctly elsewhere, it's additive in nature, right? we're going to add an element of this. We're going to add an element of this. We're going to add an element to combat. We're going to add an element to focus. We're going to add an element of asymmetry of the factions. Add an element of asymmetry of the technology tree. Add an element of the end round crises events that may happen in 2 of the modes. We're going to add the asymmetry of the fleets. We're going to add the asymmetry of the agenda cards in not 1 way, but 4 ways. We're going to add the resources, the 5 difference that you're going to have, not only in terms of production, but also gathering and how many you can keep in the first place. So it is a sum total of a lot. And you have to ask yourself, when, for my gaming experience, when for my gaming enjoyment, does that sum total surpass what my bucket can handle? And when does it start overflowing into this becomes an enjoyment in terms of a mental exercise and engagement versus this is becoming a beast and a burden that I'm not sure I can bear? I don't know where that is for you. But this is by far and away the heaviest game that I have ever played on the channel, period. Ultimately, I'm not going to tell you one way or the other whether or not I recommend this game for you or whether or not you should get this game. I'll say very clearly, distinctly, this is an absolute masterpiece of a game. At the same time, this is going to be a masterpiece for very few because of the significant elements that I have barely glazed the surface on in this game review. Impressions more than anything else. The interaction of a typical 4X is not going to be as present. The dynamic engagement of the Voidborn versus your own ships is going to be at your discretion. So if you're looking for more of an interactive 4X heads up, what are other people doing? How is the game dynamic changing? This is going to be less. If you still want a good old-fashioned hardcore strategic Euro with a space theme and elements of a 4X alongside of it, this is going to fit that much better in terms of it. At the same time, I wouldn't solely throw it in that corner and say it's only for people who are looking for exactly just that. But the problem with this is that you won't know until you probably try the game yourself and see how you feel. And even then, once probably isn't going to be enough. This isn't a game where I can go, yeah, you're going to have a good sense of how much you like this or whether or not you like this. I mean, unless you are absolutely on one side of the fence or the other, I absolutely hate everything this is bringing, or I absolutely love this, you're not going to know. And then I hope somebody in your group bought it rather than you. Because if that's the situation, right, it's going to require that much more of a commitment from you to figure that out. And that's not a bad thing nowadays in the sort of speed dating, gaming, board game realm that we live in, right? To get more engagement with and more of a relationship with one in particular. You're going to be monogamous, essentially, with this game if you buy it to figure out whether or not you like it. And depending on your personal feelings on that, or your group's feelings on that, that may change as well. And again, the actual game itself, mechanistically, is rather straightforward, but the amount of incorporation that is necessary to make this program run in the first place is visually as well as mentally draining. And whether or not you have the bandwidth from those aspects in order to, when you finally get the end result, is it going to be worth it from that side of things? And that's a question that you have to ask yourself, especially for the price point and the amount of limited time, space, and effort we have nowadays in general. As someone who is working full-time, has 3 kids, and is doing this on the side, right? Playing whatever I can, whenever I can. That is not insignificant in terms of factors. All in all, I'd say probably the heaviest recommendation I can give it is in terms of if you're looking at this from a solo side, it's probably, arguably, best at solo. Solo seems the most optimal way to fit it in terms of what you're looking for versus what you're getting out of it. Thankfully, competitive and cooperative don't stray, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, from the core design and elements of this game in the first place. But overall, cooperative is probably going to, again, be slightly easier, in my opinion, from a aspect of ease to the table rather than competitive at this point. So just food for thought, if you will, based on my very, again, limited impressions here whatsoever. This game is not black and white, just like many things in life. Some are going to present it as a technical masterpiece and achievement in a 4X situational space that does things from a solo, competitive, and cooperative in a manner that we have not really seen well done in other gaming approaches. Others are going to look at this and say the bear, the burden, the mental prowess, the setup and teardown time are going to make it inaccessible for many that would otherwise potentially enjoy this. And the honest answer to both of those things is yes. That's the truth on both sides of things. And where you draw that line in terms of what's acceptable and what's not nowadays is really what's going to determine whether or not this is right for you. This is not a hard game to learn the core of. This is a very hard game to incorporate all of the information as it's being thrown at you like sticking your mouth over a fire hydrant. Are you going to sink or are you going to swim when you're presented in that situation? Ultimately, I can understand why people love this game. At the same time, I'm not sure I can justify keeping it in my collection at this point. Not because of its fault, but because of my own personal limitations with those aspects that I mentioned as a whole. Because that's ultimately going to be what matters most. Not how technically excellent a game is, but can it be utilized to the extent in which I would like it to be in the first place. On merit alone of design, I have no doubts that this will fall on many people's top 10 lists, or even many people's all-time lists, or even many people's best solo games of whatever, right? But from that aspect of things, I cannot also say that all of those things hold true necessarily for me, nor will they for you. So that's how I feel right now about Voidfall. It's an absolute achievement, but it also doesn't get away from some of the crowdfunding production side of things with the massive amount of stuff in general. And it doesn't necessarily get away from some of the design elements at the same time that we've been seeing lately, where more is being thought of as more, right? More is better. More layers versus more miniatures, right? I'll make this comparison at the end. More layers, depths of mechanisms, right? Here you have layer upon layer upon layer of resource management, card play, asymmetric driven utilization, asymmetric beginnings, and dynamic phases that are all different, and the layering of all of those versus the layering of, say, a crowdfunding campaign with a stretch goal box where you get 30 different miniatures with all slightly different powers. A layering this way as opposed to a layering this way. And my one fear nowadays is sometimes we get stuck in our own bias thinking that our layering is better than the other person's layering. Or ultimately we prefer one type of layering than the other. What scares me at the same time is that I'm not seeing necessarily less layering in either regard, but more being a sign of better. And with more commonly seeing 40-page rulebooks nowadays on games, even without this amount of layering, it sort of makes me a little trepidatious in general. And I hope that this is the exception rather than the rule going forward, if that makes sense. So there you go. My inadequate thoughts on Voidfall. Thank you, Mindclash, for being willing to send me this to experiment with and to trial it out to be able to talk to you guys in the first place. Hopefully this was mildly helpful, or at least amusing how out of my depth I am in the first place. But sometimes I like talking about things that I'm not fully familiar with or as accustomed to give a little bit of a different perspective from someone who is also not necessarily going to be as strongly feeling one way or the other towards this. You know, for example, I love hard cooperative games. You know, for example, I love abstracts, but sometimes it's nice to hear, what does that person who doesn't like abstracts think of this game? Is that the one that won them over? Is that the one that changed their mind on things or not? And why? So hopefully this was a little bit helpful in terms of the why. I'm done. Peace out. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day.